Good morning. My name is Tosca Bruno van Vijwijken and I co-direct the transnational NGO initiative at the Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs at Syracuse University. Today I'm undertaking a brief interview with Colm O'Cuanachain, the Senior Director of Campaigns for Amnesty International, who is visiting here in the past 2 weeks as a Moynihan NGO Fellow. Thank you, Colm, for allowing us to interview you. This will be a helpful tool for faculty and students alike.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about your sector. So, first of all, what is the nature and mission of Amnesty? You would think everybody knows, but let's just make sure.
Well, at its core, Amnesty is a human rights organisation, an organisation that's fighting for justice for people who've experienced human rights violations, for example, unfair imprisonment, unfair trial, torture, and indeed people who are experiencing hunger, starvation, people who are experiencing human rights violations at the hands of police who are, for example, operating outside the law. A whole range of issues in every country around the world, and it's an organisation that was founded in 1961, so it's been around for quite a while. 2.8 million members in countries all around the world right now, and we have offices and operations in about 80 countries. So a very in-depth programme of research, exposing the truth around human rights violations, and then action, campaigning to address those issues by our members and our supporters around the world.
Okay. Now, how did you personally first become interested in what we call here in academia transnational activism?
Well, personally it came from my own experience growing up in Ireland, where at the time we had a conflict in Northern Ireland, so the issue of justice and fairness and rights was very real and painful for young Irish people at the time, and it was a conflict which I was very concerned about, and was involved in some of the reconciliation work and cross-community work in my own country. Became very aware of the fact that international actors were going to be needed and necessary to help people to see a way out of conflict in the communities in Northern Ireland, and became mindful and understanding of the power that can be exercised at international level when players like human rights organisations get involved. So there's a leverage and an impact that you can get at international level, which can really break down enmity and break down hatred and break down injustice and non-discrimination, and bring about peace and fairness and justice and dignity at national level.
So that's really what motivated you in the first place, that personal experience.
Indeed.
In your own context. That's very interesting. Now, if I look at Amnesty International, what are, let's say, 3 core challenges your organization is facing at this very moment, and how is Amnesty dealing with those core challenges?
Well, I guess the first one is coming back to our mission as a human rights organisation. I think part of the downside of what we've seen in the context of counter-terrorism initiatives over the last 6 to 7 years has been the enactment of legislation in countries all around the world which have eroded civil liberties and have constricted the space of human rights defenders and civil society activists to speak out and to hold governments accountable. We're seeing governments now using new laws to constrain the NGO sector, to limit the capacity of NGOs to register, to limit the capacity of human rights defenders to speak out. And that's really having an enormous and terrible detrimental effect on civil liberties around the world. And it's the number one challenge facing us, this rollback on rights. Battles we thought we had won around issues like torture are being eroded, and just fighting to stand still is a huge challenge for the human rights movement on a global stage right now. Secondly, comes from the issues around the interface between what the financial crisis, globalization, trade, debt, development, human rights. All of these issues are becoming more and more coherent in terms of how they're affecting people, and the solutions have to be more and more coherent in terms of how we address them. So there's this complex interdynamic running between environmental organisations, human rights organisations, development organisations, microfinance organisations, disaster relief organisations, and so on, where we really have to get our act together and work more effectively and more coherently together. The same dynamic is playing out at UN level, where the UN agencies that are working in different areas have to play out more together. And it's playing out at government level, of course, where government policy
Right.
has to be much more joined up and coherent. And that dynamic of coherence, whether it's in terms of the solutions or the problems, is a real challenge. I mean, it's a complex issue, and we're really grappling and wrestling with that. And the third one is in the whole area of accountability, credibility, legitimacy. Who is an organisation representing? Who do we speak for? What's our legitimate role, and on what basis are we speaking out for the rights of others? And that whole question of organisational accountability is deeply challenging for the NGO sector, and it's a very important discussion, and it's one which is qualitative, and it's empowering, and it's moving on. And for us as an organisation, it's one we're taking very seriously, but it is a complex issue.
Yeah, well, I find it really rewarding to hear you say, to describe those three core challenges, because for us in academia it's important that we check whether our research agendas to some extent at least are aligned with what NGOs are experiencing as their core challenges. Now, turning to your particular stay here at Moynihan as an NGO fellow for the past 2 weeks, what was the particular organisational challenge that you were facing, that you were researching while you were here?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, it runs across those 3 points that I made, where if we want to be more coherent and if we want to be more impactful, we've got to work with other organisations. If we're going to be more accountable and we're going to be much clearer about who we represent and our credibility as a representative organisation, we've got to work in partnership. And if we're going to address the human rights problems, which are so obvious now, we're going to have to work in partnership. So partnership and how we do it effectively, how we do it in a meaningful way, is the issue of concern to me. There's lots of examples of how Amnesty International has engaged in partnership over the decades, but unfortunately not too many of them are positive, and not too many of them have been effective. And there's far more examples of where resources have been wasted or at least not used effectively than situations where I can say that this collaboration or this alliance really added value and made a difference for people experiencing human rights violations.
So that's what you were focusing on here at the Moynihan Institute, I see. Now, how does Amnesty International define effectiveness, and how do you know when you are effective? How do you assess that?
Well, in one sense it's easy, because human rights at the end of the day are black or white. People are either enjoying their rights or they're experiencing human rights violations. So communities living in the slums in Rio have a very strong sense of the solutions they need Amnesty to win for them in terms of more effective policing, less sexual violence in the slums, more access to housing, more access to education, and just a sense of their lives being safer and more secure. They have that very clear benchmark for success based in human rights law and human rights standards. So they know what they want from Amnesty. So that's when you get to that stage, it looks very clear. However, the problem is, these are very long-term structural issues, and you could be involved in campaigning on some of these issues for decades and see very little progress. So it's about how do you make sure that while you may know where you need to go in human rights terms, that the steps you're taking are actually progressively moving in the right direction and meaningful. So measuring the interim steps or identifying the interim benchmarks can be really, really difficult for us as an organisation. And knowing that we're being effective can be complex. Another dimension to this, of course, is the fact that there are so many actors in the areas we're working. If a change comes about for those slum dwellers in Rio, it could be because of local policy change. It could be because local service delivery agencies have got increased funding from central government. It could be because local NGOs have managed to do something quite effective. Or it could be because we were part of the overall solution and change. So talking about how we contribute to change in an effective way, rather than attributing any of the changes that we are part of to our organisation or to our members, is another dimension that makes it all very complex.
Very complex indeed, but very worthwhile at the same time, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, we know of very many cases and campaigns where we have made a difference. We've documented enough of our campaigns and done enough case studies and investigations around our work to be able to show to ourselves where, how and when we've had an impact. So we know we can make a difference, and that's part of the motivation. the stories of change and the stories of liberation, the stories of freedom and justice that we've been associated with over the decades and that we've chronicled over the decades have given us that sense of confidence and that sense of commitment to continuing to do this kind of work. And sure, for every one of those success stories, there may be 100 where we haven't succeeded, but that's all the more reason to try harder.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my last question is, what leadership skills, formal and informal skills, do you think are crucial to be an effective leader in Amnesty as a specific organization? How would you define what it means to be a good leader in Amnesty?
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, Amnesty is an organization of people. It's an organization of volunteers, of activists, of supporters, of staff, volunteers and interns, and of managers all around the world. And if we are to be successful, it's because of the people we have. So you've got to be people focused if you want to be a successful manager and leader in an organisation like Amnesty, and understanding the value and worth of people, their skills, their understanding and their knowledge, and building the people you have around you to be better than they can otherwise be is part of the mission. So people focus is very important. Second thing is focusing on processes, means as well as ends. You know, human rights aren't just ends, they're a way to improve society, and they're also a way to improve organisations. So bringing human rights principles back into the organisation and seeing organisational management as a process of participation, a process of fairness, a process of inclusion, empowerment, capacity building, these are all human rights principles. And bringing those processes back into the organisation and using them as a leader, as a manager, to enable and to unlock energy is so valuable and so important. And then there's also this issue of managing competing priorities and demands in a very difficult life and death environment sometimes with limited resources. You do have to be a bit of a magician sometimes, and in those situations where people haven't got access to resources to do their campaigning, there can sometimes be conflict, there can sometimes be tension, and you really have to be a process manager and a conflict manager and a people manager. You know, the soft side of management is so important in the NGO sector, because you don't have the bottom line and you don't have the level of resources that you might in the private sector, for example, and the accountabilities are much more intense and 360 degrees, and you really have to be mindful of that if you want to be an effective leader in the not-for-profit sector.
I see. Well, thank you so much for these very articulate answers today.
Well, thank you too.